And we're live here on the Fantrax YouTube and Twitter channels talking Week 10 fantasy football. Each week, I dive into every single matchup and highlight who has a positive matchup that can translate well for fantasy football and DFS plays. So I have a bunch of guys to talk about today, going to fly through them. Stick with me if you are watching this live. As I said before, we dive through each of the matchups, highlight who has a positive one for fantasy football, maybe some DFS plays. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not, but I think it's good to have a mix of guys because leagues are different, and sometimes the obvious guys are guys you want to play in those DFS lineups. So have a handful of guys to run through. Let's get into it, starting off with Michael Pittman Jr., who plays the Patriots, who allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 10th most passing yards per game this season. Michael Pittman Jr. ranks 6th in targets. He averages 9.6 per game. That's solid volume right there. He also ranks 7th in yards after the catch and 15th in receiving yards. He's only scored 3 touchdowns this season, but he ranks 3rd in red zone targets, so that number should go up. Week 10, I think, is a good matchup for him on paper. We also have Josh Downs, questionable for the week. I could be missing an update on that one, but that could mean even more volume for Michael Pittman Jr., who looks well connected with Gardner Minshew. Next on the list, same game, Ramondre Stevenson. The Colts allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 9th most rushing yards per game this season. Stevenson was the running back 2 for fantasy football last week. He rushed for 87 yards on just 9 attempts, scored a rushing touchdown. He caught 4 passes for 42 yards as well. He was the running back 6 back in week 6 as well, which marks 2 big games across the last 4 weeks for fantasy football. The rushing volume may not be ideal for him. He's been carrying the ball 10 or fewer times for 5 straight weeks, but he is still edging Ezekiel Elliott in snap percentage by a decent margin, and he's still plenty involved in the passing game. He's had 3 weeks of 5 or more receptions. He ranks 4th in targets, ranks 5th in receptions, 8th in receiving yards for the position. So he's having a good year through the air, similar to last year. I want to mention Lamar Jackson this week, and not because he has a plus matchup. The Browns are actually a terrible matchup for fantasy football for all positions, but back in week 4, he was the quarterback 4 for fantasy football against Cleveland. Jackson threw 2 touchdowns. He rushed for a touchdown in that last matchup against the Browns. So I think he's due for a bounce back week. He's been the quarterback 18 and the quarterback 28 the last 2 weeks, following a week 7 where he was the quarterback 2 for fantasy football, which aligns more to the expectations of Lamar Jackson. He's been a top 10 fantasy quarterback 5 times this season. My tight end start of the week was the tight end 1 of the week last week. Dalton Schultz faces the Bengals, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. The Houston offense was on absolute fire in week 9, and Schultz was a big part of that. He finished week 9 again as the tight end 1 for fantasy football. He caught 10 of his 11 targets for 130 receiving yards and a touchdown, 27 fantasy points. Schultz has finished as the tight end 6, tight end 6, tight end 2, asterisk, tight end 36, and tight end 1 across the last 5 weeks. The connection with C.J. Stroud looks very good, with 2 of his last 4 games earning double-digit targets from the rookie quarterback. So I like him to stay hot in this Week 10 matchup. Joe Mixon plays the Texans, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Prior to the Week 7 bye, Mixon was the running back 14 or worse in all 6 of those games. He was having a bad season. In the last 2 weeks, however, Mixon has finished as the running back 8 and the running back 9, 87 rushing yards in week 8 with a rushing touchdown. And then in week 9, he scored another rushing touchdown and caught 5 passes. We have T. Higgins out for this game. We have Jamar Chase a bit banged up. I like him to stay involved in the passing game in week 10 and have his 3rd consecutive top 10 fantasy week. Brandon Ayuk, a guy I feel like is due for maybe a bounce-back week. The Jaguars allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 3rd most passing yards per game this season. Ayuk is coming off of a week where he finished with 109 receiving yards and finished as the wide receiver 22 prior to the week 9 bye. Ayuk was red hot in week 1 and week 8. He finished those games with 129 and 148 receiving yards as the wide receiver 2 and the wide receiver 8 for fantasy football. So we know that's kind of in his bag. Since then, though, Ayuk has been outside the top 20 wide receivers in fantasy football scoring, but continues to stay very involved in the 49ers offense. Ayuk has been very efficient, ranking 2nd in yards per route run and 5th in yards per target so far this season. Debo should be back, but I'd like Ayuk in this plus matchup to be the 49ers standout. Calvin Ridley. So the 49ers allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. After scoring under 7 fantasy points in week 6 and 7, Calvin Ridley scored 14.3 last week. Ridley caught 6 of his 10 targets for 83 receiving yards in that last week's matchup. Ridley has finished with some quality fantasy points twice prior to week 9. He scored 24.1 as the wide receiver 6 and then 20.6 as the wide receiver 9 in weeks 1 and 5. The issue has been the consistency in the volume. 2 games over 100 receiving yards and 2 weeks of double-digit targets and 5 weeks of 8 or more targets. So, we know those things can happen at any time. Still believe the guy can ball. It just needs to be more consistent. But in a matchup against the 5-3 49ers, that's a +1 for wide receivers. Look for Ridley to be heavily involved in this game. Chris Olave faces the Vikings, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. He finishes the wide receiver 10 in week 9, which marks the first top 12 finish since week 1. Olave caught 6 of his 8 targets for 46 receiving yards. He scored his 2nd touchdown of the season. Although the production has not met the expectations for Chris Olave, he is the 7th most targeted wide receiver on the year. He averages 9.4 per game. Derek Carr is averaging 35.1 passing attempts, so the volume is there for the Saints. Olave ranks 1st in deep targets and 2nd in air yards for wide receivers. The issue at hand via Player Profiler has been the catchable target rate, and the target accuracy just ranked poorly, number 76 and number 84 for wide receivers. So coming off of a quality week and a plus matchup, I like Chris Olave to continue in a positive trend. Aaron Jones, who, we've been worried about because that hamstring issue has been lingering, but he faces the Steelers, who allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. We're thinking he's healthy. He got cleared from the injury report. Week 9, he looked himself. He played a season-high 57% of the snaps. He totaled a season-high 24 touches. Great volume right there. Finished last week with 73 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 4 catches, 17.9 fantasy points. So back-to-back weeks with 4 receptions and 3 straight weeks of 5+ targets shows the dual threat ability of Aaron Jones. He opened up the season as the best fantasy running back. He totaled 41 rushing and 86 receiving yards with both a rushing and a receiving touchdown. So the hope is that, they've been a little bit precautious with him, but last week's volume is a trend in the right direction for him being more of a workhorse. I want to talk about Najee Harris. So Najee Harris faces the Packers, who allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 10th most rushing yards per game this season. A lot of attention is going to be on Jaylen Warren because he had his best fantasy week in week 9. He had 88 rushing yards and 3 catches. But Najee Harris is still the lead back in this committee. Harris played 58% of the snaps compared to Warren's 40% of the snaps. In week 9, he rushed the ball 16 times for 69 yards and a touchdown. He caught 2 passes, 17 and 18 touches. The last 17 and 18 touches in 2 of the last 3 games is decent volume for Najee Harris. And he finished as the running back 13 and the running back 12 in these weeks. So I think a lot of people are hyper-focused on who is the second back in this committee. But Najee Harris, things have been trending up for him. DeAndre Hopkins, one of my favorite plays of the week. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 2nd most passing yards per game this season. It's a great matchup. Hopkins had his best week of the season in week 8, which was rookie Will Levis's debut. Hopkins caught 4 of 6 targets for 128 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns for 34.8 fantasy points. He was the wide receiver 2 that week. Week 9, a lot of people will just look at the fantasy scoring and say, hey, it was a down week. But what was encouraging was the 11 targets from Levis. And Levis threw the ball 39 times in that Steelers loss. So what that says to me is that Tennessee is allowing their rookie quarterback to sling the ball, which we don't typically, tie to the Tennessee Titans, knowing they have Derrick Henry. Hopkins finished with 140 receiving yards back in week 5. He's lined up to have another good week, maybe a great week against the Buccaneers, which is such a good matchup. Mike Evans, same game. So Mike Evans, again, faces the Tennessee Titans, allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. He cooled off the last 2 weeks after finishing as the wide receiver 7 in week 7. Evans opened up the season, though, on fire. He scored a touchdown in his first 3 games straight. He's had 5 on the season, 3 weeks over 80 receiving yards, 3 weeks of 10 targets, and 5 weeks finishing as the wide receiver 21 or better shows the potential for him to have big weeks. And I think week 10 against the Titans is a good week for him to bounce back. One of the most frustrating players to talk about in fantasy football, and I get it because he's insanely talented. He's just not utilized the way we want him to. But Bijan Robinson has a great matchup against the Cardinals. The Cardinals allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 7th most rushing yards per game this season. Following that week 7 nightmare, when Bijan was like quote unquote sick, Bijan has finished as the running back 18 and the running back 37 the last 2 weeks. So that's not what we like to see. The volume has simply been frustrating. He's lost work to Tyler Algier, especially in the red zone. Across the first 4 weeks of football, though, Bijan finishes a top 12 running back for fantasy football in 3 of those weeks with 2 20-plus fantasy scores. So encouraging still is he's playing 65.7% of the snaps on the season, which ranks 10th. We want that better, obviously, but it's not horrible. He was at 74% of the snaps back in week 8, which was not too long ago. So 3 weeks of 5 or more receptions and 2 weeks over 100 rushing yards shows the talent that we believe in. I think Arizona just presents such a good matchup for him to bounce back for fantasy football as well, even if Algier stays involved. Now, this is not going to be a plus matchup, but I think this is a very important plug. And I think Marquise Brown is slept on as a potential league winner. Not in the sense that he is going to be like the wide receiver 1 the rest of the season or anything like that, but his cost right now and what he's valued at versus what his production could be, I don't think align. The Falcons are, again, not necessarily a plus matchup, but Kyler Murray is back in action. And that's, the reason I want to talk about Hollywood Brown. Hollywood and Murray were former Oklahoma teammates. They reunited last season in Arizona. That connection was extremely clear last year, the first 6 weeks of football, before Hollywood Brown got banged up. In weeks 1 through 6 last season, Hollywood ranked 4th in targets, 5th in receptions, 7th in receiving yards, 5th in total fantasy points. He averaged 18.3 points per game during this span. The college connection seemed to carry over into the NFL. This season with Joshua Dobbs, Hollywood has scored 16-plus fantasy points 4 times, and he's had 4 weeks earning double-digit targets in that system. So I truly believe that this guy is going to be extremely valuable, just knowing how good he was with Kyler Murray, his former college quarterback last season, who is now back. Jared Goff, another bounce-back candidate and my favorite quarterback play of the week. He's my start of the week for the position. So the Chargers allow the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the most passing yards per game this season. He's coming off of 2 poor weeks in a row, quarterback 24, quarterback 20. Not good, but prior to that poor stretch, Goff finished as the quarterback 4 in back-to-back weeks 5 and 6. This season, Goff has had 2 weeks over 320 passing yards, 2 weeks of 3 passing touchdowns, 3 weeks above 70% completion percentage. PlayerProfiler.com ranks Goff 1st in accuracy rating, 2nd in true completion percentage, and 2nd in deep ball completion percentage. So look for Goff to be a top 5, which might sound spicy, but a top 5 quarterback in week 10. Let's talk Quentin Johnston, another like touchy subject here. It might be a do or die week for him. I think it might be the case because we have these expectations and this hope, and not much has really happened. The Lions are not really a plus matchup either, but I think this will be my hot take of the podcast here. I think we see Quentin Johnston's first big game. Since Joshua Palmer went down, the 2023 first-round selection has played 70% and then 83% of the snaps. So he's on the field a lot. We saw a bit of a flash in week 8 with the rookie catching 5 of his 6 targets for 50 receiving yards. After a down week 9, catching 2 of his low 3 targets, many people started writing him off completely. But that week 9 matchup was a blowout over the Jets. It meant Justin Herbert wasn't throwing to the volume that Justin Herbert typically throws. He passed 40 or more times in 3 games this season. He averages 35.3 passing attempts per game. He threw 30 in that game. So that kind of tells you they didn't have to throw the ball as much as Herbert typically does. So knowing Johnson is the clear wide receiver 2 behind Keenan Allen, I think the Lions offense is going to create a much better game script for Johnston to have his first big game and be a flex dart throw for this week. Let's talk one of the last men standing for the Giants here, Saquon Barkley. The Cowboys are a rough matchup for fantasy football, and with Daniel Jones' season over, Tyrod Taylor injured, we have Tommy DeVito starting, and it could be a very rough one for the Giants. But Saquon Barkley presents the only possible option I would even talk about for fantasy football for your lineups this week. In week 3, Saquon was the running back 3 for fantasy football, 63 yards and a touchdown. He added a receiving touchdown, 27.2 fantasy points. Barkley then went on to miss weeks 3 through 5. Upon his week 6 return, though, Barkley is ranked 6 through 9, first in rushing attempts, first in rushing yards, tied for 5th in targets, tied for 9th in receptions, and 7th in total fantasy points. Barkley had 41 touches in week 8, which is nearly unheard of for running backs. And I think he is going to be heavily utilized and leaned on the rest of the season, just knowing the Giants' situation. Tony Pollard, another big bounce back candidate. So the Giants allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 8th most rushing yards per game this season. Pollard has had a disappointing season versus what our expectations, maybe not mine, because I was kind of out on this guy, but maybe other people's expectations this season. He's finished 3 weeks as a top 12 running back, but he's finished 4 weeks outside the top 25. So not very good. Encouraging signs, though, are that he's played 77+% of the snaps in 3 weeks. He ranks top 6 in both targets and receptions. He ranks 2nd in red zone touches. And this specific matchup is a good one against the Giants, who he played in week 1. And in week 1, he had his best fantasy week against them. He rushed for 70 yards and had 2 touchdowns. So knowing it was his only 2 touchdowns, knowing it was such a great week, knowing they are friendly to running backs like Tony Pollard this week. My guy, Jahan Dotson, I have to talk about him when all hope seemed lost. He was having a horrible season. I think he's back. The Seahawks allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. He's disappointed, for most of the year, but the last 2 weeks, wide receiver 7, wide receiver 9. He caught 8 of his 10 targets for 108 receiving yards and a touchdown in week 8 for 24.8 fantasy points. And then in week 9, he followed up that big game, catching 4 of his 8 targets for 69 yards and another touchdown, 16.9 fantasy points. So, I was a firm believer in Dotson as a prospect. I was very impressed by the healthy games he had as a rookie. He was one of my favorite sleepers coming into the season, which looked like a massive L. But last 2 weeks, he looks to what we wanted him to be. And in a plus matchup, I like him to stay as a flex play, at least in your fantasy football lineups. We have 3 more guys to talk about here. Let's talk about Geno Smith. I feel like the theme of this week are either guys that are going to bounce back or have their best week. And that could be the case for Geno Smith, who I do think bounces back in this Commanders matchup, and I think he does have his best fantasy week. The Commanders allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game of quarterbacks and the 6th most passing yards per game this season. Geno Smith was the quarterback 8 back in week 2, but has been the quarterback 15 or worse in all 7 of his other games. In 2022, Geno was a top 12 fantasy quarterback in 10 weeks, which is so strange because you look at his system and you say, hey, he has more weapons now than he did last season. So it's confusing, right? But Smith has had 2 games over 320 passing yards and 3 multi-touchdown games this season. And again, I'm going to project that this week is his best fantasy week. Another bounce back candidate, added to the list here, Breece Hall, Sunday Night Football. The Raiders allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 2nd most rushing yards per game this season. Down week 9 for Breece Hall, but he was on absolute fire in the games prior. Week 8, he rushed for only 17 yards, but he caught 6 of his 9 targets for 76 yards and a touchdown, 21.3 fantasy points. Week 6, Hall scored a rushing touchdown. He caught 5 passes for 54 yards and 20.3 fantasy points. In week 5, he rushed for a season-high 177 yards, scored a touchdown, and he caught 3 passes. After playing under 50% of the snaps in the opening 4 games, he's played 52% plus of the snaps in the last 4 weeks in a row now. So that's good to see him on the field more, producing. So look for him to have a big bounce back. And the last guy to mention on this podcast, Josh Jacobs. The Jets allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 3rd most rushing yards per game this season. Jacobs has had 2 top 12 performances in a row and 4 across the last 6 weeks. 3 touchdowns were scored across the last 2 games and 5 across the last 6. So he is scoring, and that's what we love for fantasy football. Obviously, it's easy points. Jacobs is coming off of a season highs in rushing attempts with 26, rushing yards with 98. So I feel like he's trending in the right direction on the ground. And with rookie Aiden O'Connell under center, I think he is going to be the focus of this offense and a guy that is going to continue to get heavy touches. He leads the league coming into this week in running back touches, and touches equal rushing attempts plus receptions. So look for Jacobs to be a focal point of this offense. That'll do it for this episode, guys. Make sure you guys are following the Fantrax socials wherever you are seeing this. I'm on Twitter at P2W Fantasy, at P2W Fantasy. You can go check out my feed. I have had so much stuff this entire week when it comes to different forms of content, videos, graphics, threads, articles, like you name it, and I'm probably doing it out there. So thanks for tuning in, and good luck in your Week 10 matchups.